continuity planning and risk assessment. Now, the bad news in all this security business is the fact that a company does not make any money by simply being secure. Now, instead, security is there as a continuous process to make sure that you get to live another day, that you get to sell your whatever you're selling and whatever brings you money. So security protects your assets and your business. And at the end of the day, to keep yourself safe, you need to identify what risks you're facing. And that's the process of risk identification. In an enterprise, a risk is much more difficult to identify. And this process, even though it's a vague term, the process that deals with these risks in an enterprise environment is called Enterprise Risk Management, or ERM. So the goal here is to protect your assets, okay? And since you have to start somewhere, a good idea would be to prioritize first. Prioritize your assets according to the damages they could create if they were to be compromised. So we should be taking into consideration assets through the perspective of business continuity, for example. How do you keep going if a disaster happens? How do you keep making money? How can you still have a business post-incident? Business continuity boils down to redundancy in hardware and software. If you want to call it high availability or fault tolerance, backups. Of course, they all need to be backed up by some sort of a well-established policy and test procedures. High availability sounds great on paper, but if it doesn't work, it's just wasted money. Then from a legal perspective, well, sometimes you don't directly lose business, but if an incident happens and certain assets are being affected, you become liable for prosecution, be it criminal or civil prosecution. That's never good news, and it's very likely that it will lead to loss of business and money somewhere down the road. Then we have to think about the reputational perspective. Again, choose assets that might impact your reputation. If you don't lose any money or you're not legally liable, a security incident might show you as not being so trustworthy in the eyes of your customers, your clients, your investors, okay? Not every publicity is good publicity, and a bad reputation is sometimes the hardest one to recover from. So we're going to need something called a continuity plan. This is just a set of processes that ensure that you can continue doing your business. And just like with every other type of procedure out there, it would be advisable to document it properly, to review it periodically, and also to test it from time to time. And this continuity plan should rely at least on 3 other types of procedures or documents. First off, we have the disaster recovery plan. This is going to include the procedures for recovering from a disaster and maintaining stability of the systems of the business. Also, it should be based on the business recovery plans. These should describe a list of steps that tell you exactly how to keep your business up and ensure recovery in an orderly manner, again, when disaster strikes. And finally, it should be based on the contingency plan. These are just a list of actions or the procedures that you should be following when you have to resume operation by replacing some resources, for example, by replacing personnel or replacing an entire site as an actual building or data center. So how do you calculate risk? Now, in real life, you might think that it's riskier to get inside your car and drive to another city than to take the train. But why is that? Well, you might not even realize it, but your brain automatically processes information that could threaten your life and evaluates those risks. So most likely you've heard in the news much more about traffic accidents than about train accidents. So your brain thinks that it's much less likely for a train accident to happen simply because not so many happened so far. Does this seem too simple? Yes, and the actual risk calculation process is actually not very different from this. So as complex as a risk assessment can be, calculating one single individual risk is basically a product of 2 elements. We have first the chance of that threat being realized, and secondly we have the impact of that threat being realized. Now this depends on the value of the assets that might be affected, of course, but it also depends on other indirect implications that might occur after losing that asset. So basically risk is going to be the product between probability and impact. Now, assuming that we know the chance and the impact, we can calculate risk in almost 3 ways, actually 2 major ways. First off, we have the quantitative risk assessment. This is where we try to assign numerical values to something extremely subjective like risk. So we're going to define some elements here, some variables that are going to hold some specific numerical values, such as the AV, that's the asset value. How much does it cost us to replace a specific asset in case we lose it? A hard drive, a server, a network switch, something like this, an entire data center perhaps. Next, we have EF, that's the exposure factor. This is the percentage of the asset's value that would be lost, right? Now, if you think about it, well, how could I lose 30% of a server? Well, you might not lose 30% of the server, but you might lose, for example, 30% of a 3-story building in case of a flood, right? Which happens on the first level. Just making assumptions here. So knowing these, we can calculate the single loss expectancy. This is how much financial value we expect to lose from a single nasty event. All right, so this single loss expectancy is basically going to be the product between the asset value and the exposure factor. How much do we assume that we're going to lose of that specific asset when a disaster happens or when a unhappy security incident happens? Now, to calculate this cost over a year, just like finance people like it, we need another one, ARO, that's the annual rate of occurrence. It's basically a number that says how often does this type of event happen within a year. And then pretty obvious, if we multiply the single loss expectancy with the annual rate of occurrence, we're going to get something called the annual loss expectancy. That's ALE. So basically the ALE is going to be how much do we expect to lose over an entire year, taking into consideration the asset value, the exposure factor, how often that incident is supposed to happen, and then we can draw the line and decide this is how much we expect to lose over the course of a year due to one specific type of risk. Now, the problem with all this is that it's painfully subjective. It's just guesswork. Most of the time, it's going to take into consideration historical data, but if you ever try to predict the stock market or the weather using historical data, you know how well that works, okay? Still, experience in this field helps, if not for the actual precise risk assessment, then at least for justifying the business investments that result out of this risk assessment, and they then materialize into actual security measures that get implemented. Now, the next type of risk assessment that we can perform is called the qualitative risk assessment. This is about telling a story and asking people's opinions about which risk factors should be taken into consideration and how high do they think that a specific risk factor should be, like low, medium, high, right? Now, the result of this is going to most often be displayed in some sort of a traffic lights report, which kind of looks like this. Right, pretty simple to read, right? We have the impact on the top row, the probability on the first column here. Combining these two is going to result in a low, medium, or high risk, okay? Just a bit easier to guess since we don't really need to assign numerical values, and then we have to wonder where did we come up with those numerical values, but at least it's easy to understand. Don't forget, it's still guesswork. It's a lot of guesswork here. Finally, we also have a semi-quantitative risk assessment, which, as you can probably guess, it's kind of a middle ground between these two methods. Now, simply because sometimes you need to have a dollar value for some assets, but sometimes it's completely impossible. How much, for example, is your reputation worth? How much is the morale of your employees worth? And all the risks that might address your reputation or morale. That's not something you can easily put a number on. All right. Business impact assessment, another key term, especially for the exam. This is a process for estimating the losses for a specific threat scenario. Or in other words, what's the business impact of a specific threat? And since the business is going to make money only as long as it's up and running, business impact assessments rely on metrics that involve availability. So how long is our business actually available? And of course, if we're talking about the entire business, then all the assets within the business have to be available as well, right? So we're going to address a couple of measurable factors here, starting with MTD. That's the maximum tolerable downtime, the most amount of time that a business can tolerate an asset being down or unusable, crashed, broken, disconnected, right? This is also sometimes called the maximum period of disruption, or MPTD, and depends on how critical is that asset. The mean time to repair, or MTTR, is the average amount of time that it would take to repair an asset or component when a disaster or a failure occurs. Now, this only applies in general to repairable components or repairable assets. That is, if a switch breaks, you might be able to send it back to the vendor, or the vendor is going to immediately send one back to you if you report it as an RMA incident. And the switch might get its, I don't know, its main board replaced or its power source replaced. It is repairable. But for a hard drive or an SSD, well, that's not going to be repairable. We're not going to have a mean time to repair, but instead, we're probably going to have something called a mean time between failures. That's the average amount of time that an asset or a component will be operating, or we expect it to be operating, before a failure occurs. Now, when you purchase a new device, the mean time between failures should be an important consideration, and it's a piece of data that the vendor can provide you during your decision-making processes. For example, if we were to head over to, let's say, Cisco, right, and look for one of their switches, access switch, all right, and search for MTBF, right, here we can see we have a specific section, table 12, let's scroll down here, that's the weight, here it is, right, mean time between failure in hours. You can see most of the models here have this number in the range of hundreds of thousands of hours. Now, of course, I believe you can guess that nobody actually waited this long until this switch actually failed, right? This value is built using statistical models. Don't expect that whenever you buy such a switch, it will definitely last at least this amount of time, but it's still a metric that can be used in a risk assessment. All right, we also have a metric called recovery time objective, or RTO. Now, RTO is the shortest period of time that an asset or a component should be fixed to prevent any negative consequences from occurring to the business. Essentially, the recovery time objective should be the acceptable amount of downtime, and as such, it should be smaller than your maximum tolerable downtime. So basically, it's the amount of time that we expect to have to wait to bring that asset back into a functioning state. Next, we have the work recovery time, or WRT. This is the difference between your maximum tolerable downtime and the recovery time objective. Basically, this metric tells us how much time is left over after our recovery time objective, but before any negative effects are really experienced. Now, this time here might be used to reintegrate that device into the network, to reconfigure that replaced system, to restore the data from a backup, any additional work that needs to be performed on the device itself before it can actually be used just like it was sometime before it crashed. So you might be able to get a new server in 2 hours, but you might need like 6 hours to restore a huge backup on that server, right? In that case, a recovery time objective would be of 2 hours, and the work recovery time would be 6 hours. And you would better calculate your maximum tolerable downtime to be less than 8. Otherwise, you're going to have a problem. Finally, we have the recovery point objective. The RPO is relevant to data. It's more like a point in the past. It's the amount of data loss that a system can support measured in time. Think about storage or databases. If you lose your storage devices and you have to rely on backups, well, if those backups are conducted daily, then your RPO is going to be something along 24 hours. So it's basically going to be the most recent time in the past from which you can restore a valid backup. That's a recovery point objective. Or, if you want to look at it from a different perspective, how much data you are comfortable losing whenever you're restoring from a previous backup. Because the backup is probably not going to be completely in sync one-to-one with your working data. It's still going to be behind 1 day, a few days, a week perhaps. Now, if you're comfortable with that amount of time because, well, you were the one who configured that backup in the first place and you agreed with the backup policies, then that's going to be your recovery point objective. So we identified the risk. What can we do with the risks that we identified? Well, first, we can perform something called a risk avoidance. That is, terminate the cause of the risk completely. Stop doing whatever you're doing that attracts that risk. Now, if you get rid of the risk, you're probably going to have to get rid of some functionality that presented that risk in the first place as well. Now, if this is applicable to your business, if this doesn't shut down your business completely, then by all means think about it as a valid solution. Next up, we have transference or sharing, risk sharing. This means that the risks can become somebody else's problem. This is going to be some sort of a involvement of an insurance company. It's also some sort of a risk transference whenever you're contracting services from a cloud provider or from your ISP. Now, of course, apart from the obvious benefits, there are still two downsides of this risk transference or sharing. First off, it costs money, right? You're basically converting risks into money. You're going to have to pay for insurance if you want to shift the risk from you to the insurance company. And even though you will transfer the tangible risk, again, breaches of data loss, it's not everything about the cost. An insurance company might reimburse you with a nice sum of money for your loss, but nobody can put a price on your reputation and the trust that you lost in front of your clients. We can address the risk by mitigation or remediation. That's basically do something to reduce that risk. We either reduce the likelihood of the risk or we reduce the impact of the risk, right? We reduce it to a level where we make it acceptable. Usually this is going to involve deploying some countermeasures, some control in there. So as nice as security vendors think their solutions are, mitigation is never about completely removing a risk. It's just about lowering it to an acceptable level, which brings us to risk acceptance, right? The last step, just like in the stages of grief. The last one is acceptance. Sometimes the effort, the time or the cost of a security control that mitigates a risk is too high, right? And also after implementing and patching and you installing the compensating controls, there is always still going to be some residual risk, right? And perhaps that residual risk is going to be made up of unknown vulnerabilities, right? We've patched everything that we know about, but we should be aware of the fact that there might be some unknowns in there, things that we don't know about, vulnerabilities that haven't yet been discovered or disclosed, and the risk is still there, right? So you can never bring the risk back to complete zero unless you absolutely perform avoidance. That is, you're removing the source of the risk altogether. And of course, risk acceptance has to be performed only after everybody has understood what kind of risks we have decided to live with, right? So basically the risk assessment process is a process that we perform in order to bring all the risk in the enterprise down to an acceptable level, not to zero. The impact of an incident is a definition of how much impact will a security event have. Is it going to cost us money? Is it going to cost us availability or reputation? Are we going to lose anything due to that event? So the first step when an incident is discovered is to properly identify it, to understand what it is that we're dealing with and how we can expect it to affect us, right? So we have a high-level classification, which is kind of like a taxonomy-based classification in which we just label it, we identify it, right? So we're going to define incidents by their category. What kind of incident was it? Was it phishing? Was it an out of service? Was it a host compromise? Was it some worm outbreak out there? And so on. Then we can go deeper and then try to identify the vector, who or what was affected, how long it lasted, stuff like that. And from an impact perspective, of course, we should decide how severe was the incident. Of course, this is going to be highly subjective, but we still have to assign some values to this. Now, from a scope-based classification, we're going to think about how much was it affected? Was anything critical affected? Did we have a local or an organizational event? An organizational event is going to affect the mission essential functions. It's going to affect the overall operation of the organization. While a local event is only going to affect probably a department, maybe a user group, maybe a few systems, maybe just a single user. Right? Now, this type of scope can be used to evaluate the severity of the incident, at least at first sight. And unfortunately, where you draw the line here is not always clear. For example, if the web server was affected, you could say the impact is local. But if it also damages the online business, because all your business was conducted through that web server, then the impact can also be organizational. On the other hand, the number of systems affected doesn't necessarily and accurately reflect the impact of the incident. It might be that you have hundreds of workstations affected by a worm, but no data breaches and with no impact to the overall business, perhaps just a loss in performance. Another classification is by how difficult is the recovery going to be and how it should be done. Now consider the number and complexity of all the steps required for recovery. How much time will it take? Perhaps consider that the business will not function at all until you recover completely. How much money do you need to spend to bring everything up online? Another classification is this about an immediate impact or a total impact? Immediate impact means that this is the direct cost of the incident, specific asset damage, specific cost from downtime, fees, penalties, anything that we can easily calculate. Now, total impact is going to be any costs that arise after the incident, right? Did it affect our reputation? Did we lose some clients? Did we lose some business? Did we lose some partners, right? It's basically the result of the immediate impact after you draw the line, well, in a couple of days or weeks, and see the ripple effect of all the negative stuff that stemmed from that original incident. So at the end, all this evaluation, all this classification is going to be a bit of a complex answer to the question, how big is the impact going to be? So for a risk assessment, the purpose is to determine the probability of a threat. And risk assessments should be conducted whenever a new system is installed or whenever a new system is planned to be purchased or integrated, or even periodically because other related factors might change in your environment. And the risk assessment should address a couple of very important points here, starting with the system characteristics. Understand the system, understand the risks that apply to it. How is the system used, and what kind of risks does this type of usage going to attract? Right? From a hardware, software, user, connection perspective, right? Pretend you're an auditor that you are evaluating a completely new device or a completely new solution. Then it should also address threat identification. It might be human threats, it might be technical threats like, breaking passwords, malware, denial of service, and so on. Motivation for those threats as well, right? That should also be part of that risk assessment. If we know that we're withholding some very sensitive information that a lot of people would pay a lot of money or they would be willing to perform some data breaches to obtain it, then that's probably a good enough motivation. Another topic that the risk assessment should address is vulnerability identification. Things that we know could be exploited. Vendor security intelligence or our own vulnerability scans or penetration tests should also be part of this risk assessment. So we just should be evaluating ourselves as part of that risk assessment. Then control analysis, right? What we already have, what kind of devices we have in our network, technical and non-technical assets as well, preventative assets, detective assets, deterrent assets. We talked about this in a previous video. Then it should also address the likelihood. How often can we expect that event to happen? Is it going to happen every hour, every day, every month, every year, right? Take that into consideration. Impact analysis, that's going to be the adverse impact of a compromise. Do we expect to lose confidentiality, integrity, availability, money, right? Human life even. So this is where you should draw the line and actually calculate the entire risk that you're facing. And finally, after you've evaluated and calculated the risk, make sure you think about control recommendations, because the actual purpose of a risk assessment is not only to figure out how we are currently standing from a security perspective, but how we can improve. So we need to recommend some actions, we need to recommend some new controls to be implemented. And of course, this should be part of risk assessment because we should ask ourselves the questions like, is this specific control worth it? Is it worth investing this dollar amount in order to lower the risk by this much or not? And of course, just like everywhere else in IT, don't forget about documentation. If you're doing this and you're not writing it down, it's going to be lost in a couple of days or weeks or months. Its value is going to be zero, especially later on when somebody else comes after you and tries to figure out what is the current state of things and where exactly they should start if they want to improve your security posture. And whenever you're performing or preparing for a risk assessment, try to keep in mind the first and foremost objective: security of assets. These assets are going to start with people, of course, and then all the other assets that make your business valuable and functional. So what you're looking for is to minimize the risk, minimize the loss, try to make sure that any security incidents or unhappy security events don't happen again. Make sure that the recommendations of the risk assessment will increase the stability of your network, of your system, and also that the risk assessment is going to ensure that you avoid being liable for other damages related to any potential security incidents. And finally, as part of the planning phase, you should take care of a couple of things, starting with an incident response team. This is probably going to be made up of people, representatives from each department that are going to identify the critical services in each department, because that's where you're going to start from the critical assets. Then you also have to have some trained individuals with mixed skills, right? Like networking, servers, cloud, databases, and so on, also part of the incident response team. You should think about a business impact assessment to assess risk. This is going to help you determine the loss in case of an event. Make sure everybody knows what their responsibilities are and the tasks for each member in case an incident happens. And don't just think about technical procedures and technical people. Think about communication. How do they communicate with each other? What kind of information they should be sharing at any point in time, especially during an incident. So develop the risk assessment policies and procedures. Develop the incident response policies and procedures step by step. Don't forget to communicate them to your employees, to the involved people, by performing trainings and workshops and making sure that there is enough awareness for these policies to be properly applied. And don't forget to test them. Test them using drills, using tabletop exercises. Try to bring to the table any kind of idea, any kind of new idea, even from unexpected people, from other departments. You might not realize what risks you're facing because you don't completely understand how a specific department works. So talk, communicate, ask for feedback, ask for input, and try to bring it all together into something that is going to improve your security posture and it's going to make you sleep well at night. Alright, so for the exam, make sure you remember and you can understand and recreate and use in practice the formulas that we just presented right here for risk calculation and the quantitative risk assessments, right? Understand what is the asset value, exposure factor, single loss expectancy, annual rate of occurrence, and all that stuff. You're most likely going to be asked about those in the exam, and most probably it's going to be as a scenario with actual data that you need to calculate. Also, regarding recovery after a disaster, make sure you understand maximum tolerable downtime. Make sure you understand the difference between RTO and RPO. What does MTTR or MTBF mean, right? Also, make sure you understand all that. Now, you should be able to explain these things without much difficulty, because otherwise you risk confusing the terms, which is exactly what the exam is going to test you on. So make sure you really understand what all these acronyms mean, because you will need to apply them in real life scenarios. Alright, so thank you so much for watching. Hope to see you next time on the next video, because we will be talking about incident response phases and communication, and that is going to be the last video of the CySA Plus training. Alright, so thank you so much for watching. Like and subscribe if you found this useful, and see you next time.